Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to have the chance to speak with you all tonight. When Tony first asked me if I wanted to come talk with you about the news media and the election, I thought, well, I'll do it, but I wish we had a more interesting election season where candidates would make outlandish claims and hide their medical history and lie in advertisements. But none of that is happening, and so this will be a really short talk. Tony asked me to talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes and then spend the rest of our time together just having a conversation, which is how I prefer it. I'm a professor. I don't mind hearing the sound of my own voice, but I'd much rather hear what you all have to say. And so what I wanted to do today is focus a little bit on the news media, but mostly on us and how we react to the news coverage that we see, anticipating that maybe a lot of the Q&A might be about the media itself. But of course, there's free range on any question. I'm happy to answer anything. But this has been a really peculiar election season. It's been an election season where we have a candidate with no political experience within a heartbeat of the presidency, and we have a person who has been in Washington for several decades within a heartbeat of the presidency. So we have kind of a quintessential Washington insider versus a quintessential outsider, and they have incredibly different strategies about how they communicate. One prefers to go without notes, doesn't really enjoy the teleprompter, isn't afraid to change his mind and kind of evolve his views over the course of the campaign. The other is very tightly regimented, doesn't do press conferences, prefers to have paid advertising do most of the communicating. It's a very peculiar season, and it's very difficult for those of us who have a decision to make in a few weeks to figure out who we're going to vote for, because it's really difficult to figure out what's true. And when we're getting ready to cast a vote for president, it's pretty important to know how truthful the things are that are being said by the people who are running for office. And so how do we do that? How do we decide what's true in such a divided, polarized country? So what I want to talk a little bit about today is how we can decide what's true. And there are kind of two big things that we need to think about in order to figure out what we should believe and what we shouldn't in a red, blue, and purple America. And the first is thinking about news coverage, right? So the graphics here are from the website PolitiFact, who fact-check claims that politicians make. They occasionally fact-check claims that people in the media make, but most of what they do is fact-check politicians. You can find them at politifact.com. The Tampa Bay Times is the newspaper that started this. It's a national organization now. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel has a PolitiFact arm that does fact checks in Wisconsin, if you're not familiar. And they rate claims that politicians make on a scale from true to pants on fire. Right? So this claim is true, it's mostly true, it's half true, it's true with this data but not that data, or it's mostly false, which is, if we're really technical about it, maybe the claim is accurate, but in fact, there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical about it, all the way to this claim is so outlandish, they give it the pants on fire rating, right? The liar, liar, pants on fire. And news coverage can help us figure that out. And this is kind of a new movement in the world of journalism. You would think, well, isn't the whole purpose of journalism to check facts and get them to be correct? But when journalists traditionally, from the early 1700s on, were thinking about fact-checking, they were thinking about spelling names right, getting the dates right for when things were happening, accurately providing the number of the name of the bill that was passed and the contents of that bill. Not fact-checking claims that politicians would make. Their job, as they saw it, would be to report the claims politicians made, and we would sift through those claims and decide what we believed and what we didn't believe, and who we wanted to vote for and who we wanted to vote against. Recently, in the past decade, a whole movement of fact-checking has sprouted up all around the country and around the globe. PolitiFact was really the first that got a lot of attention, but factcheck.org also does a great job. The Washington Post has a fact checker, and they all rate these claims in different kinds of ways. And so we need organizations like this to help unpack things that candidates say. Right? When Hillary Clinton says, well, what I'm telling you now is the same thing that I told the FBI, and the FBI director said that what I've said in all these contexts about my emails has been consistent. And so Secretary Clinton has said that a bunch, saying that what she told the FBI about her private email server was consistent with what she said to the public. And PolitiFact has checked that claim and found it not to be wholly true, but more half true. Some of the things she said have been accurate across time, and other things she's changed the way she's talked about her private email server, how she used it, what emails she sent, and so on and so forth. Other kinds of claims have been fact-checked with greater veracity. So for example, Donald Trump the other day on Friday said, Hillary Clinton has not answered a single question about her immigration policy. And PolitiFact rated that a pants on fire because she's answered hundreds of questions about her immigration policy since she announced that she was running for president. And so fact checkers can help us start to unpack what's true. But that work is only meaningful if the second element also exists in order for us to figure out what's true, and that's that we have an open mind. And so most of what I'm going to talk about today is how we interpret what we are told is true by members of the news media. But just really quickly, because fact-checking is such a new thing, and because I can promote my colleague Lucas Graves' new book, Deciding What's True, fact-checkers really are interested in kind of 4 big questions. The first 3 are, what claim do I check, right? And so when you hear, for example, Donald Trump say, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it, that's an impossible claim to fact-check because it's in the future, of course. And so that's something that is very difficult for an organization like PolitiFact or factcheck.org to check. Another claim that's really hard to check would be when Trump says things like, I'm a builder and my buildings are great. Well, how do we define what's great? Are we going to all agree on some definition of what great is? And so when fact checkers begin to do their work, they really try to focus on claims where they know they can look at data or the public record or secondary sources to weigh in on whether or not that claim is accurate and accurate within an appropriate context, right? So if Hillary Clinton says, thanks to my work on children's health initiatives, 6 million kids got health insurance, that's a claim that can be fact-checked. We can look at how many kids had health insurance before that bill was passed, how many kids in the years after, does that come close to her number? If it's not 6 million, why isn't it 6 million? Does it depend on who we count? Does it depend on who's a child? Does it depend on whether people over 18 are still staying on their parents' health insurance? But we can figure that out and weigh in with the result. So fact checkers are really curious about how we select claims to check. And then they, of course, worry about how to rate claims. Do they rate them on a meter, like PolitiFact does, from true to pants on fire? Do they rate them like the Washington Post does? The bigger the lie, the more Pinocchio heads appear on the bottom of the screen. Or do they do it like factcheck.org, where they don't give a rating, they just give you a really long analysis, and then you decide after reading that analysis what you think. But they don't say that's true or that's false, but under only these circumstances. And so those are kind of big questions that fact checkers ask. The other thing they have to worry about is, how often do they fact check different kinds of people? Right, so for example, in the Madison media market on Channel 3, an alum of ours, Jessica Arp, does a regular series where she looks at claims politicians make and looks at whether or not they're true or not. And the way that they do it on Channel 3 is one week they check a Republican and the next week they check a Democrat. So it's very balanced in terms of whose claims they're looking at. But if one candidate is on the campaign trail and says 50 things that are provocative, and the other candidate's on the trail and says 3 things that are provocative, if you did 3 and 3, that's an imbalanced way of trying to check facts. And so fact checkers really struggle with their desire to ferret out the truth and their worry about being accused of favoring one side over the other or favoring particular kinds of political positions, whether healthcare reform was a good thing, whether climate change is real or caused by humans. They'll weigh in with what facts say, but they don't want to keep harping on those things for fear of being called biased themselves. And so that's kind of just a 5-minute version on fact checkers. And I hope in the Q&A we'll talk a lot more about news coverage itself. But what I thought it would be interesting to talk about with you all for the next 20 minutes is how we respond to the messages that we get and how we as a people decide what's true. And one thing that's really changed when it comes to the information that we choose to accept or reject is that the world is fundamentally different than it was even when I was growing up. I'm 40, and so when I was growing up, and if I wanted the television on in my house as a 10-year-old, and if I wanted it on at 5:30, maybe I'd rather have the TV on than have to answer questions about school from mom and dad, the news was on, all 3 channels. That was it. If I wanted the TV on, I had to watch the news. And they were all fairly similar broadcasts. because each of the three major networks were appealing to the entire American electorate. If one of them just favored a conservative point of view or just favored a liberal point of view, they were turning off at least a third of their audience. And they didn't want to do that in such a tough competition for advertising dollars and ratings. And so, during the period, the golden age of television, you had an electorate that voted more and was more knowledgeable about politics and was more moderate. So the kind of late 50s to early 70s was a period where American ideological identification was more in the middle. People sharply disagreed about a variety of issues, from taxes to the Vietnam War to civil rights, but people were closer together in their attitudes than they are today. People are deeply divided, or many people are deeply divided in their attitudes today. And one thing that's changed is, instead of the news being on all three channels at 5:30, we had the explosion of cable in the late 80s and early 90s. So you could watch the kind of the broad network news, or you could choose Fox News or CNN or later MSNBC and get news that was telling you you're right and your political enemies are wrong. And that's a pretty satisfying thing to do, right? To see that I like hearing that I'm right, I like hearing the people I disagree with are wrong. Lots of other folks do too. The other thing that happened was that there were more channels than just news. If at 5:30 I wanted the TV on, I could watch SportsCenter and not have to worry about politics and all the things politicians do and say. And so for a little more than half of us, the age of cable meant I can still be entertained, but I don't have to learn about what's going on in the world. And so political knowledge started to drop in the country. Less people watching the news made them less interested in politics, which made them less likely to vote, and voter turnout dropped during that same period as well. And so now we're in an era where we choose our news selectively. We're not constrained to where our information comes from. We have, with the internet, an infinite number of choices. And with social media, we have a way to share those things really quickly and react to what other people share really quickly as well. We can even talk back to reporters. It used to be you were just yelling at the TV screen. Now you can tweet Jessica Arp and say, well, I didn't like your fact check. And you can tell her that and she'll respond to you right there on Twitter. And so things have really changed. And when it comes to where we get our information, they've changed in ways that make it less likely that we're going to hear the other side. And when we're less likely to hear the other side, we're more likely to become entrenched in our own views. And so what this data are showing you is the results of an experiment where we varied headlines. So just headlines about different kinds of news stories. Some hard news about the crime rate or tax policy or a protest about abortion or a same-sex marriage ruling. And soft news about the weather, about sports, about news you can use kinds of things. So we just had these headlines in random orders for our participants. And then there were different options for the source of those stories. So if you were doing the study, you might see the abortion headline with Fox News after it, but you might see that same headline with MSNBC after it. And so what we varied was the topic that we're talking about and who was reporting on it. And what we found was that, so the kind of the dark black lines are the hard news stories, the lighter lines are soft news stories. Democrats were more likely to pick CNN or were more likely to click on a headline if it didn't have a source than they were to click on one if it was Fox News. Republicans were way more likely to click on a source if it was Fox News, even if it was soft news. Even if it was just a story about the weather forecast, they trusted Fox more than they trusted CNN. And so there's a selectivity to which people now go after the news that they want. And you see people who are in the middle weren't very different, right? They were about as likely to choose Fox as they were CNN.
What year was that?
This was 7 years ago.
Can you define the selection rate that you have there? What does that mean?
So the selection rate is what's the likelihood that somebody will pick this source over that source? And the likelihood ranges from 0 to 1. And so roughly you would say Republicans have a 50% chance of picking Fox News and hard news when they're faced with a set of choices. And Democrats have about a 16% chance of picking Fox News. So, a 30-point difference between what Republicans and Democrats would prefer to do. But this is just, news stories from news organizations that cover politics. There's lots of other kinds of news that are just available on the internet. And this work comes from some folks at George Washington University, Eric Lawrence, Henry Farrell, and John Sides. And they were kind of looking at a similar idea, but they wanted to know who clicks on what websites do people go to. And so they picked some conservative websites the Drudge Report and Michelle Malkin. They picked liberal websites like the Daily Kos and Huffington Post, and you can see the size is how many people who identify as liberals or conservatives are clicking on each place. And so what you can see is that the strong liberals were picking Crooks and Liars, Daily Kos, and the Huffington Post, and strong conservatives were clicking on Michelle Malkin, Little Green Footballs, and the Drudge Report. And there wasn't very much, like the lines are pretty thin on the other side. Liberals were slightly more likely than conservatives to click on the other side. And so there are kind of two possible explanations for that. One is that liberals are slightly more interested in what the other side has to say, and two is the conservative websites are more popular, and so they were just more likely to get more clicks. And we're not quite sure which one of those things is true, but by and large, the big finding here is that liberals click on liberal websites and conservatives click on conservative websites. A student of ours did some work with us to try to figure out, it's not just one thing we're clicking on, right? It's not just that I sit down and say, well, will I choose Fox or MSNBC today, right? I have an infinite number of choices. I can look at television, I can look at the newspaper, I can listen to the radio, watch network TV, cable TV, or those same choices but on the internet, or social media if I want to get my information. And so we started to think about what we might think of as news repertoires. Where do people organize their choices? And so what we're looking at here are people we might on the far right call news omnivores. So people who just like news. They don't care where it comes from, they just want information and they'll go anywhere they can to get it. To people who just want conservative news, those who prefer just liberal news, and also it turns out that people who prefer liberal news also prefer to get it online. TV and print preferers, people who just prefer online only, and people who avoid news altogether. And what we're looking at is the likelihood they'll choose different kinds of sources. And the only thing I really wanted to point out is for the, maybe I'll just hop up here. There we go. The conservative, this bar here is representing conservative news sources. So people who prefer conservative news, not surprisingly, are way more likely to pick conservative news. But they also do have an interest in print news and a little bit of an interest in online news. Liberal folks really like online news, and they also prefer news from liberal sources, but not as much as they just want it to be online. And so liberals and conservatives are a little different in how they prefer to get their news. Liberals want it online. It doesn't necessarily need to be favoring a liberal perspective. Conservatives tend to prefer news favoring the conservative perspective. And once again, we have two ways we could think about that data, right? One way would be, oh, well, liberals are just more open-minded and they prefer a wide range of sources. Or another interpretation is most of the media are liberal, and so it doesn't matter where they go because most of the media feeds their point of view. And again, it's difficult to disentangle which of those two things it might be, but those are both possibilities. But the long and the short of it is that about half of us are in the news avoiders category, and about a quarter of us are either conservative only or liberal online. And about 15% of us are news omnivores who get it from everywhere. The biggest category, though, are the news avoiders, those who just would rather not hear about what's going on. Was there a hand that went up? Yeah.
Is there any factor about the age of the different people?
There's not a huge difference. Younger people under 35 are more likely to pick online, but that's diminishing. That was a big effect 10 years ago. It's a much smaller effect today. So we're getting our information from all kinds of different places. Most of them are more likely to feed our own point of view. So does that affect what we believe to be true? So in one study, we had a news anchor from a market that wasn't nearby read two news stories, one that appeared on CNN and one that appeared on Fox News. But they read it in front of a green screen, so there was no background. And then later we superimposed three different backgrounds. We imposed the Fox News newsroom background, the CNN background, and a background that didn't have any kind of label. And so we showed people these stories and asked them whether they thought the story was biased. And what we found was that, so the yellow bars are strong liberals, the red bars are strong conservatives. A 50 would mean that story is conservatively biased. A 0 would mean that story is liberally biased, and 25 would mean that's a pretty darn neutral story. Liberals who saw the story on CNN, even if it was actually the story that was the Fox script where they thought they were watching CNN, those liberals said, that's a nice moderate story there, 25, perfect. beautifully unbiased story. The same with when they weren't given a label. There was no difference. Conservatives saw that same story on CNN and thought, this is a liberally biased piece of garbage. The same stories, whether Fox or, now we think that they're on Fox. The strong conservatives, the red bar on the far right, they're saying, well, this is a beautifully balanced piece of news. And the liberals are saying, look at how conservatively biased this story is. But when we showed other liberals that same story and said it was on CNN, they said it was just fine. And so part of what's happening is it's not even the message that is in the news, it's the source that we get it from that colors how we think about whether it's true. So this is a depressing finding, right? That before we even hear what they have to say, we've decided whether we're going to believe it. And that's one problem with deciding what's true is our own biases. Yeah?
So I saw somewhere, and this gets at veracity and news reporting, that talked about fact-checking and looked at different news media, TV media. And there was, at least by this study, a dramatic difference. I don't want to jump into people's politics, but a dramatic difference in the amount of unforced errors on the Fox News channel versus, say, NBC. They found some on MSNBC also, but just the amount of things that weren't accurate.
Yeah,
higher on a certain network. So is that a bad study, or is that true, or does that explain why people don't believe what they hear on a certain channel?
It might, right? But here, all the words are exactly the same.
Right.
And so at least fundamentally, liberals and conservatives are likely to be skeptical of the other side. But there are studies suggesting that some shows on Fox are more likely to make claims that don't stand up to fact checking than the broad NBC, ABC, and CBS programs. MSNBC kind of comes in second in terms of the having problems with the truth. In those situations, is a way to put it. And so the programs, so for example, like on Fox with Brett Baier or Shepard Smith, those are traditional news programs where they're delivering the news. Those programs don't have that problem. But programs where people are giving their opinion, so on Fox, The O'Reilly Factor, Sean Hannity, on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell, those are the shows that are more likely to have those issues. Yeah, yes.
But B-roll truth is different from text truth, and I think that distinction.
For what was the first kind of truth?
B-roll.
The
type of footage. For example, we had Madison portrayed as being a hotbed of violence during the uprising in 2011, whereas the background of all of that had palm trees. It was taken from footage from some type of a riot, and even though things were relatively
I've not seen a palm tree in Madison, yeah.
Palm trees were displayed, and there
I'd like
were
to see
several
that.
other mistakes like that where people at Fox News have explained it as, we just pulled the wrong B-roll.
There is research that compares people's visual consumption of information versus their auditory or reading things, and the visual seems to come first. A colleague of mine, or two colleagues of mine, Devon Shaw and Chris Wells, have done this really cool study where they've been collecting 10% of Twitter for 4 years. So that's a lot of data storage, first of all. It took us a year to figure out how do we get the data back out to look at things, because it's just so much. But so what we've done kind of together, the Social Media and Democracy Group, is look at the presidential debates and compared what President Obama and Governor Romney would say in the 2012 presidential debates and what people then would respond to on Twitter. And then none of us are experts at all in body language, but a friend of ours at Texas Tech, Eric Busey, is. And so then he had an army of poor graduate students code all of the different body language things that the president did and the governor did during these debates. And it was the body language that really got people excited on social media, more so than what the president and the governor were actually saying. It was when President Obama strode toward Romney and talked about whether he called an attack a terror attack or not. The attack in Benghazi, I think was the attack he was referring to. But like those sorts of things really set people off. The visual stuff, the B-roll, those things do matter. And it's really hard to think about how we measure that in a study. There's a really famous story, 60 Minutes did a piece that was really negative about Ronald Reagan. And the story goes that one of Reagan's staffers called Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes to thank her for the story, and she couldn't believe it. And he said, oh, well, all the pictures of Reagan were in front of cheering crowds, and that's what people are going to see. And so the video is super important. I think that's a great point. So one worry that people like me have about the proliferation of more partisan news sources is, will those sources then affect our judgments in ways they otherwise might not, because they're telling these stories that are more slanted toward one side or the other? And so in a series of experiments, participants were shown stories about different issues in 2010, 11, and 12. And so issues about the economy, the war in Iraq, healthcare reform, terrorism, immigration, and then adding all of those together for an overall score. And so what was varied in this study was whether the information was pro-attitudinal, which is to say that information lined up with what the person watching the program believed. So you're being told you're right, or whether it was counter-attitudinal, you're being told you're wrong. And when it was pro-attitudinal, in almost every case, approval of the president, this is the dark black line, for almost each issue, approval of the president goes up. When you're being told you're right, you approve of the president more. And when you're being told you're wrong, you disapprove of the president more. And so this made us worried about the future of the country, if people's beliefs about whether the president's doing a good job are simply affected by whether the source is telling you you're right or telling you you're wrong. But it turns out that the largest effect for that are for people who don't watch the news anyway. So if we break it down by, you can see each of these bars has a prefer entertainment or prefer news. So on the tax the rich story or lower taxes, it's a story about the tax system being unfair. For those who prefer entertainment, so those who don't have experience watching the news or don't have very much experience watching the news, they're greatly swayed by what they see on the news. They're just being shown this information for the first time. Partisan news sources present that information in a persuasive way rather than kind of an objective, balanced way, and it worked. But it makes us feel a little better because the people who are most persuaded aren't watching the news very often anyway, and so those who watch it a lot weren't nearly as affected by that, which makes us feel a little better about people's attitudes. Then, researchers also wanted to know, well, what about judgments of bias? And one thing that's completely unfair in the previous sets of studies that we've talked about is that all of these people, whether it's the CNN Fox one or this one or the news repertoire one, and all of these stories, researchers are deciding for you what you're going to watch. Come into our lab and here's a Fox News show, or come into our lab and here's MSNBC. None of you have someone else forcing you what to watch, although maybe each person who's married will say, well, maybe my partner makes me watch this and I'd rather not. But you all have a choice, right, of what to watch. And so in one study, we gave them the choice. So here are 5 options. A program that's not at all related to the news, a partisan conservative program, a partisan liberal program, and a couple of programs that don't have a discernible ideology, at least in terms of how they're described. And when people get to choose, then we're less likely to think that that source is biased. We think that we've selected a good source. And when we're forced, we think that is more biased. And we especially think so when that source is telling us we're wrong. So when we're getting the counter-attitudinal information, the 2 bars that go up are in conditions where you're being told you're wrong and you didn't get to pick what you watch. When you're told that you're wrong and you get to pick, these are the white lines, the judgment of bias is much, much smaller. So 0 would mean the person is judging that story as unbiased. And when we have a choice, we're way more likely to make that decision than if we don't have a choice. And so that's the environment where we encounter fact checks. We've chosen media that fit our views. Those of us who are real news junkies and like to, find those partisan sources and hear that we're right aren't as likely to be affected by them. But we also don't think that they're biased. So we might actually end up believing things that aren't true because we accept them, but they come from that partisan source that makes these errors, right, that you were talking about. And so do these fact checks work? A scholar who's at Dartmouth now, named Brendan Nyhan, has studied something called the backfire effect. And in a particular study, he exposed people who were conservative to stories about whether or not weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. And then it exposed liberals to those same stories and said, now, people believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, but it turns out that he did not. And then after showing them that story, they would just ask, so do you think Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? And they thought going in, surely the information showing you that he didn't will cause people to say, well, no, he didn't. But in fact, those who were very conservative actually had a backfire effect and were more likely to believe than before they walked in the door that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And so they saw something telling them they were wrong, and they doubled down. There was a backfire effect on correcting that information. And all the liberals in the room were saying, ha, 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 I knew conservatives were like that. And so then Nyhan showed a story about stem cells and President Bush's policy about stem cells. Liberals believed it was far more restrictive than it really was, and when liberals were shown that information, they said, no, I don't believe it. In fact, I believe it more wrongly in the previous direction. So both conservatives and liberals, when they're, are equally likely to reject information that tells them that they're wrong. Now, this doesn't mean everybody does it, right? The shaded area around the line is the confidence interval, which is to say that's within those lines, each of our attitudes fall within those 95% of the time. So it's not that every liberal or every conservative is being told they're wrong and saying, no, I'm right. But there's an effect that's consistent across people that says, on average, most folks do when they're told that they're wrong.
It's just the men.
Right, so yeah, a lot of folks have looked, is it just men, is it just women, is it, is it young people, is it older people, is it people who are working, people who aren't working, is it people from the South, is it people who are new to the country, is it, all these kinds of things. And we have one answer, who does this the most? If there's one group of people who are the most likely to be told they're wrong and conclude that they're right, any guesses?
Someone who's very confident.
And politicians, yeah. They would fit under what the answer ends up being. Any other guesses? White males? Politicians? What was that? No? The educated. People who've graduated college. And the reason is that when you go to college, you learn how to argue. You learn how to use evidence for your benefit, to make arguments in your philosophy papers, and your English papers, and your sociology papers, and your political science papers. And as people are trained to argue, they get good at it. And when someone says, well, I know that you might believe that President Obama was born in Kenya, but here is a copy of his birth certificate, an educated person who is skeptical about President Obama's birthplace might say, that could have been forged. And so you say, okay, well, there's a birth announcement in the Honolulu paper the week after he was born, and it just seems unlikely that, in the event that this baby, who's African American is going to become president in 45 years, why would they put a birth announcement in the hometown paper if he wasn't born there? Oh, well, that's just because the dad wanted to stay in the country, right? So you can make arguments back and forth, right, in any way that you might want, right? And the educated are really good at making those kinds of arguments. And so this makes us all feel, I think, a little worried. And so I think the big question is, does anything help that? Does anything push back against our penchant of fighting back evidence with our own ability to reason and argue? And it turns out that the thing that helps the most are visual cues, again, right? And so which is why it's so important that the pictures that we see are accurate. And the research that shows this shows a bunch of liberals two different situations. So in this half of the room, I would show you a story that said after President Bush initiated the surge policy in Iraq, when we brought in a bunch more troops really quickly, the number of deaths in Iraq that were American dropped precipitously. And after I tell you that in a story, liberals reject it. The liberals over here, I show you this graph. Here's when the surge begins. Here's the number of attacks that happen afterwards. The visual evidence persuaded liberals in the visual group that didn't persuade liberals in the reading group. And so we thought, well, does this apply to conservatives? So what would be an issue where, that's, not the surge in Iraq, where conservatives would be likely to be happy with President Bush's policy? What about climate change? So we tell conservatives, 5 different organizations from across the world that study global planetary temperatures say that they're getting warmer, and that is not in dispute, and conservatives over here say, I don't care. We show this picture with NASA, with the Met Office Hadley Center, with the Japanese Meteorological Agency, all overlaid the average temperature of Earth from 1940 to 2010, and when we showed them the picture, it's unambiguously going up on average over that time, and conservatives in this group say, yeah, it must be happening. And so visual cues seem to help, which gives us some reason to be hopeful about people's abilities to decide what's true. And so I just kind of wanted to end on kind of two big thoughts. One is that we're in an era where there's a widespread dissemination of what's true and what's false. But it varies greatly based on what information you're watching, right? So Fox News covers Hillary Clinton's emails and health way more than MSNBC does. And MSNBC covers Donald Trump's statements that he makes way more than Fox News does. The New York Times covers the Clinton Foundation's exploits more than they cover the Trump Foundation's exploits. And so depending upon where you get your information, you're learning what is and isn't true in different kinds of ways. But as long as the fact checkers are being transparent, as long as they're saying, here's where we got the information that helped us weigh in about what's true or what's false, we should feel pretty good about this movement. The other question relates to us and our own particular trust in the news media. There are lots of great reasons to be skeptical of the news media. And politicians have made hay for 50 years by running against the news media and complaining about bias in coverage and all of that sort of thing. And just the other day, a couple of weeks ago, I guess now, are you familiar with Charlie Sykes, a local talk show host in Milwaukee, talk radio host, widely regarded as a powerful conservative talk show host who's promoted Governor Walker and Speaker Ryan, but has also been a person who's been very against Donald Trump and has been credited in some circles for Ted Cruz's win in the Wisconsin Republican primary and not Donald Trump's. But Mr. Sykes is a conservative talk show host, but has recently been talking a lot about Trump and how Trump has been able to be so successful. And one reason that he gave was that kind of the information environment that includes talk radio did what he said is eliminate the referees, which he went on, it's a really long quote, but in the quote he's basically saying, for a long time, talk radio has told people not to trust the news media, and now the news media are coming around and saying, these things that Donald Trump is saying aren't true, and people are rejecting that because they've been told for 25 years not to trust the news media. And so Sykes said, we've created this monster, and we have to figure out a way to rein it in, while still being skeptical of that mainstream media because he has legitimate problems with the mainstream media. But he also has been more introspective lately about some of the issues that come from that. And so thinking about those two things, I think, are important for us to do. And so I think I'll stop there and then we can just kind of deal with questions that you all have and anything you want to talk about. Yep. You watch just the advertisement, and it's erectile dysfunction and dentures and yeah.
The students I teach, I ask them where they get their news, and it's fascinating. They all have different ways. We'll pick an event. Where'd you hear about this? And it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's
Yep. The Skim. Yeah.
It's NPR. Weirdly, they listen to NPR when they're in their car. So, and myself, I spend so much time following the Twitter feeds of journalists.
Right.
Talking to
Me
each
too.
other, essentially. And that's another way of kind of like, anyhow, the news just seems to be so diffuse.
Right.
And the last thing I would think is the place I get any information is television news. Although occasionally I turn it on, almost sociologically.
Yeah.
But, so the news is becoming this kind of thing that just floats around. And there's so much skepticism about all of it. So I think everyone, and this is part of what I think cable news is, I should say Fox News, is made everybody skeptical. And they've actually taught people to be skeptical, just like we teach in college. You should be a critical thinker.
Right.
And so they're critical thinkers, with kind of very circumscribed amount of information given to them. So everybody's skeptical. Everybody's got a flood of information around. So what is, in your opinion, the news anymore?
That's a great question, right? What is the news now? And so, one way to think about this is, well, geez, in the 1920s, newspapers are in trouble because this new thing called radio is going to kill the newspaper. And then 30 years later, this new television is going to kill radio and the newspaper, which wasn't killed by radio. And then cable news is going to kill broadcast television and radio and those newspapers. And the internet, oh, that's going to kill cable news, network news, radio, and the newspapers. And it's not that anything has really been killed. It's all still there. It's not as popular as it was. So instead of 60 million people a night watching 3 networks, it's maybe 21 million people a night. But it's people who vote. It's people who pay attention to politics. And so even though television news is not the power that it once was, it still is a place where the most voters get enough information to make decisions about how they want to behave in politics. And so local television news is still the #1 source for people to get their information. It's declining, but local TV news is still #1. The internet is rising really quickly. Print news had dropped for several decades, but it's leveled off. Print news and television had precipitous drops in their audience, and they've broadly leveled off. They're still slightly declining, but they've broadly leveled off. Now, there may be some new development in another 6 days or 6 years that change this, but we live in a fragmented society, and yet there are still times where what's happening is covered by everybody. So the key moments, right? Presidential conventions, debates, big events, attacks, terrible storms in the aftermath of them, those are covered by everybody. And so there's still a mass media, but all these niche sources do have really different agendas and do cause us to know about different things. So, so my mom and my dad, are married and live together in the same house they've lived in for a long, long time. My dad goes to the basement every day and watches Fox News. My mom stays upstairs and watches CNN. And when I talk to them on Sundays on the phone, they have very different ideas about what's going on in the world, just based on where they're sitting and watching all day. And so there are differences, but they've both heard of the 2 big things that happened that week. And so, the mass media are still there, I would say, and I would still say they're serving a function. But things are diffuse, and the attitudes they've developed about the people they're hearing about, of course, are pretty different as well. And I think a lot of the data here helps explain why that might be. But the news, I would say, is incredibly fragmented, but it's still mass enough at enough times to keep enough people informed. But there's a lot of slippage in that. A lot of people aren't voting who probably ought to be paying attention and voting. A lot of people who do pay attention to the news could stand to look at more than one source or their favorite source more often. But on balance, I would say the news hasn't disappeared. Even though in some weird respects it's harder to find when it's always available everywhere, I guess I would say. Yeah, sir.
So I've worked in radio and television for over 30 years as an engineer. And what we all started and grew up with was 3 networks.
Yep.
We watched the show, and that was the news.
That was the news, right.
So over time, we've seen instead of 10 outfits going to a story, now we got 400 outfits going to a story.
Right.
So we have evolved because of technology and because of the demands of the public from broadcasting to narrowcasting.
Yes.
So the narrowcasting means when you had a broadcasting, they would tell stories for all sides of the road. They'd
Right.
go all over the road and talk about what happened today. Now we've got narrowcasting. So I'm going to tune into a source that reinforces what I already believe. If I think the sky is green, I'm going to watch a network that talks about the green sky. If I believe the sky is blue, I'm going to watch the blue sky network. So us as individuals have to be vigilant to accept more than one source.
Right.
And when you show me a slide that shows how many people are tuned out, that's bad. I mean, Ferguson, Missouri, all the troubles that happened there. What do you think the voter participation rate in Ferguson, Missouri is?
That's pretty low, yeah.
8%. And they wonder, why is our community in bad shape? The recall, it turned 65% out. Regardless of the outcome, people were involved. And I'm all about that. So I guess we have to be, I get The Economist, which is an out-of-country publication, and I like to read it. And some weeks I tear it up, throw it in the trash, and other weeks I actually put it out so others can share it. But
Right.
I was over at Madison newspaper one day and doing some work for them. And they said, point blank, if we make everybody mad, we did our job. Because they have gone all over the road now. They haven't just stayed to one way of thinking. So it's an interesting
situation. Okay, so you're making your consumers mad, but they come back. Because they love you, they hate you. And as far as over-the-air broadcasting goes, which is what I focus on.
Yeah.
People say, oh, it's going away, these other platforms, it's not gonna happen tomorrow. I say, oh, why don't I just push this off button on this transmitter, and let's see what that telephone does. I mean, I'll go to a station that's off the air, up on your antenna system, and the receptionist's like, thank God you're here, the phone is driving me nuts. So what we're hearing as far as consumption of over-the-air is wrong. The cable companies are putting out these numbers about their penetration of the market. Okay, if they're in 10 hotels with 50 rooms in each hotel, they say, hey, in this part of the neighborhood, we got 5,000 viewers. Well, that's if every room is full and everybody's in the room and they got the TV on.
Right.
So there's this tweaking of the numbers. They're saying over the air is only 20%, or 10%, or 15%. Oh, let me hit this button. Let's see what happens next. The numbers are actually much higher. And even homes that have cable have sets that aren't hooked to cable or to the internet. Still. So you're trying to react to this competing platform situation that we're all trying to figure out. It's like, holy smokes, we're run over by information from 80 different dimensions. And to make a choice, to make a conclusion, to how much time do you have in a day?
Right. Right.
And we all have a belief system
Sure.
that we want to reinforce. We really don't want to watch something or read something that upends our belief system.
It's uncomfortable. Yeah.
Jesus never existed. Well, wow, I don't want to read about that. So anyways, just some thoughts about what you're studying, which is a reaction to an evolution of technology.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, I would interpret what I said to be broadly consistent with that. And so we still have all of these other systems of information. And as you say, a lot of people enjoy the battle with this information. For example, when Howard Stern's radio show wasn't on satellite radio, but it was on conventional, over-the-air radio, the number one group that listened to him the longest were the group that hated him the most. And they had to hear what this jerk was going to say next. And that's true, I think, a lot for, people take the newspaper and they disagree with the columnists, but they like that battle and they want to write a letter to Chris Rickard or to Christian Schneider or to whoever they want to write a letter to and say, you're wrong, and come back and see what that person says the next time. And so I do think that still certainly exists, and the news media know they need that. They need committed audience members to engage with them, to push on them when they think that they're wrong. I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's also right that, it's just as citizens we need to be more engaged, but it's also the case, I want to give us a little bit of a break. If Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump say something provocative, I don't have the time in my day to suss out whether that's true. I'd like to find a source I can trust to tell me whether that's true, because that's their job, not mine. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it seems to me that we have a very short attention span, so we get.
I'm sorry, I stopped paying attention to you.
So we
Yeah.
keep feeding stories, and what is lacking, or what I find really concerns me, is there are no in-depth questions. The journalists don't, I think there's so much complex news, they don't know enough or research enough. They're trying to cover all of it. Simple things like, can you divulge your tax return to the public when you're under audit? Of course you can. Nobody is,
It's not against the law, sure.
Yeah, it's
to do
not
that.
against the law. People have done it, and yet nobody's going and saying things about that. Or are you really under audit? You actually have to show a letter.
That's come up just in the last couple of days. People are starting to push back on that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's the audit letter? Whoever, it's just.
They finally got to that.
It's like basic follow-up journalism. If we had today's journalists, I don't know that we would have uncovered Watergate, because that took hard work for months and nobody's doing it.
Great
And that's what worries me.
It's investigative work is hard and it's expensive because you're paying those reporters a lot of money not to put a story in the paper for 4 weeks. And that's complicated, right? It's true. It's true, and part of that's our problem, right? Because that's what we want. We have a physiology lab in our school so we can kind of we ask people what they say they think about things, and then we see how people physically respond to different, like, negative ads or things like that. But in another study in a lab, the time that the people are most engaged and excited is right before they use the remote to change the channel. Something new is going to happen now, and that's when people are really thrilled. And so now people will watch long-form television news. 60 Minutes was the #1 show in the country for years before cable and kind of football got so popular to knock it off the top. But people will watch long-form journalism. The Atlantic, the New Yorker, the Weekly Standard, National Review. These magazines stay in business. People are reading long-form journalism, whether it's opinion or investigative stuff. But it's not part and parcel of what daily newspapers do, and daily television stations do. And one reason is just structural, right? At 5:30, the news is on, and if I don't have my story done, my station has dead air, and then I don't have a job anymore. And so, am I going to take the extra step to learn one more great nugget that I might not learn and then not finish my story, or am I going to say, here's what Trump said, here's what Hillary Clinton said, back to you? And it's the time sensitivity, the diminishing size of newsrooms is a problem. All of those things, are problems for journalists. We shouldn't feel too bad for them because we still want them to do this investigative work and should push them to do it. But then we also need to purchase it, I think, when they do. Yeah.
I think some of that time constraint is just not there, because I feel that the newscasters repeat themselves 3 to 4 times on almost everything they say during this half hour that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we take the half hour to 15 minutes because half of that half hour are ads.
Yeah, we've got 21 minutes of
So
news, or
not-
19 maybe,
okay, so
yeah.
Not
Mhm.
quite half.
Mhm.
You've got 21 minutes to do the news.
We have weather and
News,
sports.
Weather
Yeah.
and sports. The weather is repeated 3 times, and they never take a breath. They say it as fast as they can.
Yep.
If they slowed down, they'd only have to say it once. They would say.
But their research shows that people clip into the news at different times, and if they don't see the weather, they're upset. And so, for the person, for the viewer who sits down and says, the news is on, I want to see the news, they're frustrated at that third forecast. For the person who, I just got the kids to bed, I hope I didn't miss the forecast, then they maybe just see the third one. And so stations, really wrangle with that stuff.
The
And,
third thing
yeah.
that I hate, and I'm
Yeah.
sure that research has found that
Yeah.
this helps them, when they say, our next article or later in the program, this is
Yeah.
coming up,
Yep.
this is coming up.
Yep.
So they
Just do
give
it.
you this little-
You wasted 15 seconds. Yeah.
Or don't tell
You
us.
could have told me another story in that time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep. The fear that local TV news lives in of ratings and dropping ratings really, I think, caused them to spend more time promoting what they do. And so instead of maybe 12 stories, they do 8 and tell you about them before and after the commercial break a few times. Yeah, I think I share that frustration. Yeah.
Has the consolidation within the news industry impacted what we hear?
I think that's a really good question. So, on the one hand, I was making this argument that there's an infinite number of sources out there, but almost all of them are owned by 6 companies. And so, are we really getting a really wide range of options? Not really. Fox and Viacom and GE, all these companies own lots and lots of things. They own the major networks. They own dozens and dozens of affiliates. They own magazines. They own movie companies. They own all kinds of things. So it's no accident that, for example, Robin Roberts went from ESPN to Good Morning America. ESPN and ABC are part of the same company. It's no accident that people who are on the blacklist go on to the Today Show first to promote the blacklist because it's on NBC. So there's all these relationships that have nothing to do with news, but have to do with the entertainment divisions of these different companies. And so I think it narrows the range of things that we hear about, I think. But now we're also in an era where these big companies are now doing cross-promotional things together, realizing that it's better for them to be in business together than in competition with each other. And you see that even in the news. You see the CBS News New York Times public opinion poll. You see the NBC News Wall Street Journal public opinion. So you see different organizations owned by different companies partnering together just to save money, because polling is really expensive, for example, or other kinds of things. Yeah. Someone, I keep looking over there, but I should.
The networks don't own the affiliates.
Some do.
They're owned and operated. They're not an affiliate. That's an O&O store.
Yeah, but many are not anymore. Now, I would say Fox owns 20th Century Fox, and News Corp. News Corp owns dozens of stations around the country, and radio stations around the country, and Viacom. There's a,
Not that much.
and Disney owns quite a lot as well.
The ownership.
Well, you can look. So the Columbia Journalism Review has a great website where you can click on the 6 owners and all of the media outlets, whether it's local television news or magazines or newspapers or radio or movies or other kinds of entertainment divisions, and see it's a pretty long list.
But there again, how do we know what we're reading is accurate? You know, if I go to
Right.
you know, I kind of believe this gentleman. He's in the business and
Sure.
has seen certain things that the rest of us haven't.
I've got hundreds of customers that are not a factory store,
Yeah.
right? They're locals, they're affiliates. Okay, they buy programming from.
Yeah,
entities.
that's different. Yeah.
It used to be that it was more of a one-way relationship. That relationship was actually flipped. Now they have to buy the programming. It used to be that networks would pay them to run the program.
Yeah, that's totally different now.
That's
Yeah.
totally
Yeah, that
different.
changed.
But 60 Minutes is interesting.
Yeah.
60 Minutes showed the executives how to make money with news.
Yeah.
Ahead of that, it was a public service that they
Do the
were
news.
performing
Yeah.
to validate their license. That-
Well, network television used to be an hour long.
But 60 Minutes showed the suits, you can make money with news, and they all went, whoa, bonus time.
But then they also demanded that the network news begin making money too. And then they began to demand Edward R. Murrow's show make money too. And when it didn't, they said, well, then now you have to do this crappy show where you interview stars as well. And we'll let you continue to do your little news show, but you're going to talk to Liberace. You know, and so that stuff happened very early in the era of broadcast
Changed
news.
the dynamic of the news system.
Sure it did.
Became a
Yeah,
for-profit source.
yeah. Once it became for profit, yeah.
That's been a huge factor.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question
Sure.
about polling, because you had mentioned polling earlier, and it's kind of a two-part question. I'd like to know, I'm amazed at poll numbers for our presidential candidates, which were so apart in such a short time, are converging so quickly. I'd like to know how people's political behavior is impacted by the polls.
Hmm.
And when your polls are the polls gathered mostly by landline and internet? I mean, are cell
That's
phones
changing, yeah.
internet?
So it depends upon the polling agency. Some do landline phone only, which means they underestimate the number of young people in their samples. Because I ask the first day of every semester whenever I teach a large lecture, how many of you have a landline? And I think this semester one person out of 200 raised their hand. And they were, so oh no, wait, I don't want to, they're kind of embarrassed. But lots and lots of survey outfits now either do a random digit dial of landline prefixes in the phone number and cell phone prefixes in the phone number. That's still a little problematic. Like, I went to graduate school in Indiana, and my cell phone is still an 812 area code. And I graduated 10 and a half years ago, but I don't want to change my cell phone number. And so if they're judging my location by my cell phone, they've got me wrong. They've got me in Indiana. And if they say, do you approve of the governor or not, they think I'm talking about Mike Pence and not Governor Walker, right? And so, that is a little bit of a problem. Smart pollsters get past that by saying, what zip code do you live in? This is part of a survey. But there are some issues with that. Other survey outfits are moving toward kind of balanced designs of some random digit dialing phone calls and some what are called web panels. And so YouGov is a company that does this. SurveyMonkey is a company that does this. Qualtrics is a company that does this, where using random digit dialing of landline and cell phone numbers, they get a large number, say 50,000 people in their pool of potential people to do a public opinion poll. And then when someone wants to do a poll, they sample 1,000 people out of that. And so, it's not quite statistically as sound as doing it the way Gallup traditionally did it, for example. But there's lots and lots of different pollsters have different ways, and some will do where the interviewer is a live interviewer. Hi, I'm calling from the Gallup organization. I want to talk to you about who you're voting for president. And other times the phone rings, you pick it up.
So
Hello, this is a call from Rasmussen Reports. Please answer these 2 questions. And so it's a recording, asking you, and you would type in, 1 for Trump and 2 for Clinton or something like that. Those have a lower response rate and also tend to have more variance in their answers than when you're talking to a live human.
Caller ID is messing that up.
Caller ID is a problem too.
Caller ID.
People screen, yeah.
Aren't answering, so.
Yep.
I was at a lecture with Travis Franklin, and I said, yeah, we're not answering anything we don't recognize,
Yep.
so. no
And Charles
one-
is the gold standard of public opinion pollsters in the country, I would say. I mean, the Marquette Law poll is a tremendously well-run
Yeah.
poll, but he says it's getting harder and harder every
Because
year.
people who
Yeah.
have caller ID, we're self-limiting.
Yeah, people don't answer the phone if they don't know who it is.
I haven't had a poll yet.
Has anyone in this?
Yeah, has anybody here done a public opinion poll on the phone?
I got one.
I've done it, yeah.
Well,
Yeah, but not, yeah.
answer one, you'll get
Before
more.
caller ID, I answered lots of.
Oh, sure, if the phone's ringing and you don't know who it is, you've got to answer it, right? Yeah, it could be important, yeah. And the other thing to kind of think about with polling, and so my advice about polling is whenever you see a story, there's been a huge change in the polls, that's a story you should be immediately skeptical of. So every time you see the result of a poll, it comes with a margin of error, plus or minus 3 points or more, depending upon how many people were sampled and how they were sampled. And so if it's Clinton 46, Trump 42, plus or minus 3, that means if we did that poll 100 times, 95 of them, Clinton's range would fall 3 above or 3 below that 46 number, and Trump's would fall 3 above or 3 below that 42 number. Now we think 46 and 42 is the right answer, but we're only confident that it's within these 3 points. And so the best way to look at public opinion polling is an aggregation of polls. And so if you like, 538 does it, pollster.com, which is now in the Huffington Post, which is Charles Franklin's company, does it. Real Clear Politics do it. And so they have, adding together all the polls, here's where things are. And so that accounts for the occasional poll that falls outside the confidence interval of being accurate and gives us a sense of whether a change is real. So for example, there was a poll today in Ohio showing Donald Trump up 4 points. If we see a bunch more polls where he's winning or tied, then we might be more persuaded that that result is real and not outside the confidence interval. With one poll, we should be skeptical. Yeah.
Yeah, you haven't been talking about MSNBC, Pacifica, Free Speech TV. I'm a little curious, who's funding your research? Because and again, people need to get those grants. And
Oh,
all
sure.
that.
Yeah.
I'm a professor myself, and
Yeah.
you have to hustle. Are the Koch brothers funding it? I mean, the Koch brothers
They're
funding
not.
us and
Yeah.
spending a lot of money. What foundations and all of that are funding this type of research? Because we're not getting anything in terms of spectrum. As you know, CNN is not liberal. Okay, I mean, I
Right.
can't even believe, I can't even go there. And you're talking about 7 to 10 year studies over there. I've heard of those for many, many years. I've taught them in my own classes. So I'm a little concerned about what type of research you're presenting here.
So,
Your perspective, who's funding your research? Let's get to that.
Oh, the
And
National
what
Science-
kind of research is being conducted on these issues that perhaps maybe looks at a variety of different viewpoints?
sure. Well, I would say that the Huffington Post to the Drudge Report and MSNBC to Fox News and all that in between is a variety of viewpoints.
Well,
But to answer your,
you mentioned MSNBC, and when you talked
I
about
did several
NBC,
times. I did.
When you said
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
NBC, you talked about NBC.
Yeah, and MSNBC, yeah. I'm happy to go to the videotape on that,
And
yeah.
we'll
Yeah.
go to the,
Yeah.
how about Free Speech TV? How about Russia TV?
Sure.
These are becoming major forces, that we found out with the Larry King situation. So what I'm
Well, how
saying
was that a
is,
major
see
force?
that
Did anything
all your
change? Did
research
Trump's
here,
numbers are
you've got-
better since that interview? I'm not
you've
sure
got
how it's a major
CNN
force.
As
Yeah.
left, as liberal there, and you
No,
got-
no, I have it perceived as liberal. I don't have CNN as liberal. I have it perceived by the average citizen as liberal, which is different than
Well, you
some.
have to prove that. I mean, have you said, is this, again, you.
Well,
have-
but that's easy to
those-
prove.
That study, I've looked at those studies. Those studies just assume this is left.
No,
this is
that's
right.
not
Was
quite right.
MSNBC ever used, or Free Speech TV, or another source in one of those studies?
Yes,
And why
yeah.
weren't we given that information? Or
because
can you
most
tell us
people
why?
aren't familiar with them. And so when you show in an option,
People aren't familiar with it. What do you mean?
I mean that when we ask people, would you like to, if I could say 2 sentences before you speak
Let's
again.
do it.
Sentence 1, when we ask people, here are 7 options, right? So Fox, NBC, The Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, Democracy Now!, NPR. And then we ask them also, how familiar are you with these? 95+% people aren't familiar with the ones on what we would think of as the far left. And so we tend not to use them in our analysis because no one knows what they are. Now, I didn't say MSNBC. I wouldn't say MSNBC is the far left. I would say Democracy Now! Would be that example. And so part of it is many people aren't aware of it. And if you don't have enough people who are aware of it, you can't study it.
Free speech TV is on almost every cable network, but
Being on a network is not the same thing. Right, as I tried to say 3 times, the National Science Foundation, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, and the Dirksen Congressional Center, the Baldwin Riley.
I applied for a grant there.
As
Dirksen is Republican.
Oh, he was,
Thank you.
yeah.
The library,
Yeah.
I do have to interrupt and say, Professor Ware
Yeah.
was kind enough to come here.
No, I don't mind. Deliberation is great. I don't mind this at all. Yeah. Yeah.
Journalist, and I'm married to one for a lot of years, so.
I used to be one. Yeah.
So, if we can talk about that for a second, I have a few different examples. I mean, in Madison, I always used to appreciate the Wisconsin State Journal, the news in that paper, more so than the Cap Times, even though I enjoyed the Cap Times editorial page more. But I could make a distinction between news and editorial policy.
Sure.
Nowadays, though, you will say watch the Sunday programs, and there will be one thing that bothers me is on these panels you'll have news media on the panels rather than experts on the topic. But anyway,
Sure. Yeah.
you have journalists on there that pose as journalists, but then when you hear them talk, they're immediately pushing a particular position that may or may not be factual, but they have a spin.
It's mostly speculative, too, in most of
Right,
those cases.
and
I
so
would say.
my question is, what's happened in terms of journalism? And maybe it's just that there's all these forms of it now, where people get
Yeah.
but there seems to be a lack of a standard as to when someone makes an assertion. So they'll bring somebody out, a politician, and he'll say that the sky is purple. And there's almost a fear, I think, of challenging that politician for fear that you'll be accused of being biased, or you won't be able to get him back on the show again.
Oh, I think both of those things are right. Yeah.
Equivalency that happens.
Sure.
But it seemed like before, and I don't know if you go way back in 1850s, it's maybe something different, but last 30 years, there was more of a standard as to, we're going to check, we're going to verify. If something sounds really crazy, we might ask a follow-up question, because that's what good journalists do.
Yeah, the lack of follow-up questions is one of the things I despise the most about television news.
So,
Yeah.
so why is that? Do you think that's changing? But if it has changed, why do you think that's changed?
That's a good question. I think it has changed a little bit. I think there's some evidence from folks who study TV news or study like Sunday morning shows
Right.
to find there are fewer follow-up questions, in this decade than say 2 decades ago. And so it's hard to know, is that a fundamental shift in journalism or is that an idiosyncratic change because Tim Russert was different than Chuck Todd? And so is it a personal choice or is it that's the way they wanted to do things and that's the way they prepared to do their programs or something? And so I don't really know. But I would say that it's certainly the case that people who are asked to kind of serve as panelists on shows are overwhelmingly people who either worked in politics but don't have an expertise per se about public opinion or public policy or something like that, or people who are journalists and are worried, I think, about being accused of being biased. And I think the worry of being accused of being biased is something a lot of journalists who work in mainstream news really worry about, and journalists who are at outlets that are more upfront with their ideological orientation worry less about, and are more inclined to say, here's the evidence, we think we're pretty confident that we have this right, whereas I think more of the broader oriented ones, in my view, are worried of getting called biased. There's a really nice book by a guy named John Ladd at Georgetown called Why Americans Hate the Media and How It Matters. And one reason is that politicians started to get really strategic about attacking the media and made it, an increasingly important part of the work that they did. And it had, distinguishable effects on our trust in the news media. And, and there's not evidence of this in his book, but I know John, and he thinks that this also might have affected reporters' willingness to push hard in particular kinds of situations for fear of getting that kind of accusation of being biased. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Marshall McLuhan was right, that TV is a cool medium and radio is a hot medium, and as a cool medium, they don't want to have follow-up questions because that would make it too hot, if you will, or too contentious, and they want to be pleasing and comforting to the viewer and not get too much into the back and forth. Whereas radio, there's no hesitation at all on a talk radio show to.
But talk radio is different than a news program, right? Talk radio is someone giving their opinion. It's the person who's, this is my show and this is my point of view. And a news program is, here's what happened today and how we might think about it. And then television news, and especially on cable, has this layer that's somewhere in between, where there's maybe a host whose job is to try to be, fair, and here's what we think happened today, and we're going to ask, some person that we had from the left and some person that we have on the right questions. They're going to disagree. I'm not going to adjudicate between them. I'm not going to say, instead of saying this person's right and this person's wrong, the host says we're going to leave it there. Just start listening for that on these shows. We have to leave it there. We're out of time. We have to leave it there. Someone has said the sky is blue. Someone has said the sky is purple, and we have to leave it there, even though I plainly know that the sky is not purple. But that plainly know the sky is not purple is not something that's ever said on television. But I will say that some cable networks are experimenting with pushing back about claims of truth. So I think it's CNN that's done this, and I think MSNBC has as well, where they'll show, they'll take a live speech, say, of Donald Trump, and he'll say, "Where's Hillary? She's disappeared. She's in hiding." And the bottom of the screen will say, "Trump, Hillary in hiding," and then in parentheses, "She's not, she's in Ohio." And so there's been a kind of a live fact check that started to happen on the chyron, the superimposed things on the bottom of the screen. And that's an example of one of them that I can't remember whether it was CNN or MSNBC that did that in the last couple of weeks, but Trump will make a statement. They've only done it to Trump as far as I've seen. They may have done it, I don't have all these networks on 24/7, but I've seen it in that way. And so they started to push back. But cable's a little different than network TV too, so maybe there's a difference in their willingness to do that. But there's also, a week or so ago, the moderators of the presidential debates were announced. One of them is Chris Wallace of Fox News, who said, "It's not my job to fact check in these debates." And so he views his job as the moderator to ask questions, and the candidates are supposed to clash. And you might remember in the Obama-Romney race, Candy Crowley fact-checked Mitt Romney kind of live, and took a lot of heat for that, for a couple of reasons. One, for doing it, and one for being a little overconfident in her assertion that the president had said something that he'd sort of said, but not exactly said in the way that she claimed he had said it.
Well, she was present when it happened. She was an eyewitness.
She was the moderator,
Yeah.
and they were debating.
She was at the press conference when the president did say it was an act of terrorism. So she heard it herself directly. And when Romney said that wasn't so, she corrected him.
She did, but when the president said it, he couched it in a couple of caveats. And so from Romney's point of view, Crowley made it sound like he was lying. And from Romney's point of view, he was doing what politicians often do, which is say, this thing is true, and then they don't tell you the 6 caveats that have to be true for that to be true. I think that Crowley made the right decision personally to step in and say, well, he said during that news conference it was an act of terror. He said other things too, and she probably should have mentioned those as well. But it was probably better than not for the people of the country to hear a candidate said this was true and the reporter said, no, that's not quite right. It's a good instinct, but it's a big risk. And she's not a moderator, this time around. Yeah.
I don't remember the exact words, but somebody once said that the key to a democracy is an informed electorate, something like that. Is there any measurement of that that's reliable?
Well, there's a lot of measurement of that, and there's a book, I think it's called What Americans Know About Politics by Michael Deli Carpini and Scott Keeter. Michael's a professor at Penn. Scott, at the time, was at Pew, I think, the Pew Research Center. And they found, most people don't know a lot about politics, right? Not many people can name Supreme Court justices. It was just out I saw on the news the other day that we were at the lowest percentage in a long time of people being able to name the 3 branches of government. So there are lots, the average person is not very informed about politics, I think if this is attributed to Mark Twain, I don't know if he actually said it, but consider the intelligence of the average American and now realize half of them aren't that smart, right? And so, there is a question, right? It's pretty funny. I think it's funny too. But there's a lot of ways to measure it. But there's also been some interesting pushback on these measures. So the questions that measure political knowledge are, who decides if a law is constitutional or not? Which party is more liberal, the Republicans or the Democrats? Things like, or who's the Speaker of the House? Who has the majority in the US Senate? Those kinds of, most of them are fact-based questions. And some folks, most notably a guy named Skip Lupia, who's at Michigan, who wrote a really great new book called Uninformed, is really pushing back, saying these are not the questions we should be asking people. How relevant is it if you know that the Republicans have the majority in the House of Representatives to make a good decision about what you want and how you want government to be organized? Maybe we should think about how people make decisions and the evidence they bring to bear to make decisions. And if we could improve that, we'd be a lot further along than teaching people trivia about the name of the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court. And so there's some pushback about that, and we don't have great measures of those things. And so if you buy Lupia's argument that we're measuring the wrong thing, then we don't have great measures. If it's, do people have a sense of who's in charge and whether they're broadly more liberal or conservative than the people that they're competing against, people aren't terribly good at that. Voters are better at that than non-voters, but people broadly aren't terribly good at that.
I think we might have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
It's fine by me, yeah.
I got a question. So going forward, if you were in charge of the university,
Huh.
from a public policy perspective, and you always would like to think that we evolve and we're heading towards a better place. What would be your suggestion as to how do we improve both what's coming at us, but then also how we respond to it in order to kind of get people more engaged, people to vote more, and therefore hopefully better public policy decisions. How do we turn this around in a more positive way?
I don't know. That's a great question, right? That's, how long do we have? But I don't want to just punt, right? That's an important question, right? So.
The answer to the last question.
Yeah, right. But I think that's a really good question. I think it's going to require lots of different kinds of actors doing lots of different kinds of things, right? So one thing I think is happening now is because of the narrowcasting that I think you were pointing out earlier. One thing that's happened is a lot of politicians feel emboldened to only appear in certain outlets and say things that they would never say in a broader outlet because it's not completely accurate or fair or civil. And I think, people who are engaged in that kind of behavior, who are in those positions, I think owe it to their constituents to appear in other kinds of outlets, right? Barack Obama should sit down with Bill O'Reilly, which he's done, right? He did for the Super Bowl, one year when Fox had it. He did that sort of thing. Donald Trump should sit down with Rachel Maddow and Amy Goodman. Governor Walker should talk to a variety of reporters, and not just the few that he tends to favor talking to. Our leaders should make more of an effort to do that and feel more constrained. I think it would constrain them in some ways, having to talk to a broader audience. But I would also say, it's important for just, regular people to step outside of their comfort zone in just small ways, right? So not muting the person on Facebook who has the different political views than they have, but just engaging with them. And not to say, oh no, I think you're wrong, but just tell me why you have that position. I've learned a lot from people I would characterize as crazy uncles of my wife's on Facebook by just saying, tell me why you think that.
You don't have crazy uncles of your own?
I do, but I don't get as far with them. all they need to know is I live in the People's Republic of Madison, and that's all they need to know about my views. So, but I find, just tell me why you have your views is something people are almost never asked that. How did you come to that position on same-sex marriage or your approval of Governor Walker or whatever it is? And I think that's a way to start opening lines of dialogue. So one bit of research that some colleagues of mine and I have done using the Marquette Law Poll data was about the recall. And what we're really interested in is how did Wisconsin get this way? How did we go from a state with a strong progressive tradition to a state that has had a wide variety of conservative policies enacted at the state level and incredibly contentious politics at the presidential, Senate, gubernatorial, a recall, for goodness sakes. All these things happen. How did we get this way? And one thing that we learned from the Marquette Law Poll research was that fully a third of us in the state claimed that we stopped talking to somebody because of their views on the recall. And we asked that question a bunch of times. We asked it right when the recall was announced, just before it, just after it, and then a few months later. And even a few months later, 30%, I forget the exact number, still said, I'm not talking to somebody because of their view about the recall. And that's a broad public opinion poll. And so one of the colleagues on this project, Kathy Kramer, who some of you might be familiar with her great new book, The Politics of Resentment, which she spent years going around just to different places in Wisconsin. She would go to a town and ask people, where do people get together and talk politics? She would go there and say, I'm Kathy Kramer from UW-Madison. I'd like to sit with you and hear what you all have to say about politics. And in the qualitative view, she would go back to places. She would go there before the recall and then come back, and she'd be like, well, where's John? And, oh, well, he's on the other side of the Walker thing, and so he doesn't come anymore. And this is a group of people who've been playing dice for 30 years, and those relationships have broken down. And so, everything has become political. As one of the, a little overstated, but politics is in more places than it used to be in our daily lives. And I think that's had a fracturing effect on Wisconsin. And finding ways to heal those fractures, I would say, is a really important thing to do. That's kind of small ball, but I think it's something that everybody can do. Rather than say, well, I'd like you to read 15 sources a day and maybe get fired from your job, but be really informed is not a super useful answer. But I would say, check out sources that you would never check out and see what they're saying. They might not be as different as you think, or they might be absolutely abhorrent, right? But it's worth checking them out, I would say. I learn a lot doing that. Both sometimes confirmatory and saying, I knew I shouldn't have been reading that, and other times, oh, that's more reason than I thought it would be. And I think those kinds of things are useful things to do. But I would say part of this is on politicians. There, by a guy named Keith Poole, researches how divided voting behavior is in Congress. And it's more divided now than at any time in our history except for right after the Civil War, which we were literally shooting each other then. And so Republicans and Democrats in Congress are as different as can be on the issues that they vote upon. Now, extreme conservatives and extreme liberals would point out the range of issues they're voting on isn't all that great as compared to democracies in Europe, where there are real strong liberal parties and incredibly strong, more conservative parties. But Republicans and Democrats in Congress are really different. And until they start to try to bridge some gaps, it's hard for these other things to happen. Now, we have some say over that because we get to pick them, but they have say over designing the districts that everybody in the House comes from, which also makes things really challenging. But the Senate is not that way. But the Senate elections are, less frequent, and there's fewer of them. I don't know if that helps, but.
So, Mike, going forward, I think most of us will be watching the presidential debates, and to be an informed electorate, are there any points you think we should keep in mind?
I would say check out what fact checkers say. PolitiFact and the Washington Post and, pardon me?
Snopes?
Yeah, Snopes, I think, does a fairly decent job on some things. But I would check out what they say about claims that happen in the debate. So, the fact checkers are really preparing for this so that they can do things in real time. So they can post on their Facebook page and on their Twitter account, Hillary Clinton just said this, here's how she's talked about that issue before, here's what's changed, or that's exactly consistent with what she said, or, so they're really getting ready to do this in real time. And so I would say, following some of those groups, I think would be really useful in debates. And I would also say, watch them with someone who's different than you. You'll see that they've seen a different debate. And and I think that's a useful thing to encounter, I think.
I don't know if I'm the only one here, but I think there's a lot of us who aren't on Twitter or
Sure.
do this real.
Oh yeah, I would say you're not the only one, I'm sure.
To do this checking.
Well, I would say just these organizations' websites themselves. So PolitiFact's website, they'll certainly be up and running on that night. I would say, it's worth. I would say, I want to hesitate to say watch the kind of the post-debate commentary. There's some research. There's folks at the University of Arizona have found that people are more persuaded by who the commentators say won than by their own judgment of what they saw when they watched the debate. And so, sometimes, depending upon who you're watching, that can be really skewed. And who they have on, right? So, like Free Speech or Democracy Now! Is more likely to have on experts. Public television is more likely to have experts on. The major television networks are more likely to have, for lack of a better phrase, partisan hacks on, people who worked for the last presidential campaign. And, they know a lot about running presidential campaigns, but they don't have a great, first of all, they have a huge bone to pick, or, huge, axe to grind, because they favor one over the other pretty strongly. But then they also, have their own ideas about how campaigns work, and they're usually informed by one campaign instead of lots and lots of campaigns, which I would say is a better way to look at it. But of course I would. I'm a person who looks at lots of them in research, so I'm biased in that regard. Yeah.
I'll leave you one happy thought about the electorate, if
Yeah,
I may.
yeah,
I travel a lot for work,
me too.
and, right, we go down in the hotel, and there's the breakfast nook, right?
Yep.
You've got the waffle maker.
Yep.
And there's pictorial and verbiage on the 3 steps to waffle heaven, right?
Right.
So I'm putting my waffle together, and the guy comes running around from the desk and goes, "Do you need some help with that?" And I said, "No, I'm familiar with this device." He said, "Great. Most people lose it at step 2. Picture and verbiage." And we talk about attention span, and that's why
Yeah.
football is popular. It's 14 seconds of play.
Yeah.
Soccer is not popular because there's an hour and a half per play.
Right. Yeah. When are they going to score? Right. Yeah.
Most
yeah.
people lose it at step 2.
And that's making me feel better.
And all I said to him was, and these people vote. We got conversations, we gotta talk about it.
Yeah.
I think you might be onto
Don't
something.
vote, that's
Donuts
as
and
frightening
waffles
as.
and politics.
Yeah. Right. Well, a former Nebraska Senator, Roman Hruska, he was not known for being a great mind, and a fellow colleague had said, that he wasn't that bright and he was, dumber than the average American, and Hruska said, well, they need representation too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank you all for coming out, and I'd like to thank so much.
Thanks for your questions. That was great. That was so fun. Yeah. Thanks. Thank you.